I remember going on a troop ship to South Africa in 1944. We decided to have a meeting on war aims. And I was sent to see the colonel in charge of troops, and I saluted and said, "Sir, can we have a meeting on war aims?" And the colonel said, "No politics in it, Ben." And I said, "Oh, no, no, not at all." And we had the most wonderful political discussion. And one lad got up, he said, in the 1930s we had mass unemployment, but he said, we don't have mass unemployment in wartime. He said, if you can have full employment by killing Germans, why can't you have full employment by building hospitals, building schools, recruiting teachers, recruiting nurses? You've got to do in peacetime what you do in wartime, develop your policies to meet people's needs. And it was that argument that triggered the 1945 victory, brought us big social changes.
Labour will now have a majority over all parties in a House of 640.
The course of the next few years may well decide the future of civilization for decades or for centuries.
I suppose if I reflect on the way our society is organised, democracy ought to be a means by which we change the system to meet people's needs. And it's been subtly transformed into changing people to meet the needs of the system. And that is the great failure. Many people go into Parliament with left-wing ideas and then end up on the right. I went the other way. What really shifted me to the left was my experience as a minister, because I realised as a minister that governments were in effect controlled by people you didn't elect. Of course, if you want to get on in politics, you have an interest to please the people in power above you. But there are elements there where you're under pressure to do what you might not want to do because of the fact that if you didn't, you'd lose your job. And I found that slightly uneasy, but it wasn't dirty and it wasn't corrupt, but it showed that power had shifted to someone above you rather than coming from people who had chosen you. I always saw the Labour Party as an instrument of change, and then I realised as a minister that the government of which I was a member was not involved in changing things, but trying to run the system better. And that is not what I thought it was about.
He remained popular until he began to adopt a more radical political position. He spoke at the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders Work-In 1972.
We have, as the main speaker, a man who needs no introduction in Clydeside, Tony Benn. Our task, if we want a responsible society, is to give responsibility to ordinary people and take away the privilege from a minority who have dominated this country for too many centuries. Good luck, comrades. Thank you for inviting me.
After his involvement at UCS, Tony Benn moved to the left, and his speeches became more controversial.
Wilson went in the spring of 1976, and I think he realised what was coming. The International Monetary Fund and big business around the world decided they didn't like a Labour government, so they forced us to make cuts. When the proposal for the cuts were made, Callaghan, who was Prime Minister, said, well, let's have proper discussion about it. I gave him full marks for that. So I put in a paper on the alternative economic strategy, which ran absolutely against what the Treasury wanted. It was a more direct socialist control of the economy so that we would do what we thought was right and not have it imposed on us by the IMF, a completely unelected body. It was then argued about and rejected. And in the end, the cabinet capitulated to the pressure, made the cuts. And of course, when the cuts were made, in a couple of years' time, it became apparent to the people in those industries what had happened, and they took action to defend themselves.
It cost the Labour government its life. It contributed to the mass unemployment which we now have. It wasn't necessary because, of course, the oil revenue was just beginning to come. But it was the beginning of the domination of the world economy by world bankers, and the IMF is really its political voice.
It was those cuts that led to the winter discontent, that led to the election of Mrs. Thatcher, and all the price we paid for that.
We've tried to make capitalism work with good and humane Labour governments, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work, because it rests on injustice, lives on inequalities, and if you try to modify them, then they turn on you and cut back your gains and throw you back to where you started.
The argument always was, if you move to the centre, you'll win, but if two centre parties competing for public support, neither of them can be real about changing things. Mrs. Thatcher did change things. She launched into a violent counterattack against democracy and the Labour movement. She did radicalise and create a new situation which New Labour inherited in 1997. But then New Labour was really based on the idea you accepted what Thatcher had done and just bumped along. And when Blair became leader, he said in 1994, New Labour is a new political party, which really was a Thatcherite party.
And I will devote every breath that I breathe, every sinew of my body, to ensuring that your grandchildren do get to live in that new Britain, in a new and better world. New Labour, New Britain.
I think the conclusion that lay at the heart of the foundation of New Labour was the idea you couldn't win if you didn't adopt Mrs. Thatcher's policies. And when Mrs. Thatcher was asked her greatest achievement, she said New Labour. The Labour Party was set up as a socialist party, and then when Blair became leader, he abandoned Clause 4 of our Constitution. Clause 4 did make us into a socialist party. It contained within it a basic socialist idea. The purpose of the Labour Party is to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry on the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and the best obtainable means of popular administration of each industry and service. It was a comprehensive statement. Democracy should determine how our industry develop and not leave it to the simple and crude criteria of whether you were making a profit in one year or another.